Hello Internet, and welcome to the Collective Arcana. We're a channel all about tabletop gaming. Today I'm going to just sort of discuss with you a little something that came up in one of our comments, something that a lot of people might disagree with me about. It's something that is probably going to be, I guess, our most controversial video ever. It's about 2nd edition, Pathfinder 2nd edition, and adding dexterity modifier to damage. It's it's something that a lot of people are unsure about, not going to agree with me about, and that's definitely up the top. Let's go ahead and get out of the way. That's totally fine. Whatever you find works for your game, whatever you're comfortable with, of course, do not listen to me. You are not in any way obligated to listen to anybody about how you want to run your game, except your other players at the table. You might want to listen to them a little bit, or they won't stick around. But this is just something that I've found works for me and my table, something that I enjoy, something that I think is just nothing but positives overall to do. But it is controversial because of, mostly I feel because of the history of the game. A lot of people will tell you if you add dexterity to damage by default, you're going to throw a lot of things out of balance. And I do think that was true in 1st edition Pathfinder. I also think that it might be a little strong in Pathfinder 5e, where you have this idea that dexterity is this super ability score. And previously it was. The number of pure dexterity builds in Pathfinder 1st edition versus pure strength builds, there's no comparison. Outside of really niche character designs, focusing on stealth or on dexterity was the default and typically the way to success for any class where you could get dexterity to damage. And with later feats, that was a lot of classes. So with that said, and knowing that in 5th edition D&D as well, you have these really strong feelings that dexterity is an overpowered stat, a god stat they call it sometimes, and it's true in 1st edition and in 1st edition Pathfinder and 5th edition D&D and 3.5 D&D and all that. But is that still true? I don't think it is. And so this video is just going to be me sort of making a case for why you might want to implement this in your game. Certainly the core rules do not support this, and general wisdom isn't going to support this. And it's something that, even though I'm confident this is right for my game, I do acknowledge that the math on it is pretty tight, and I am not nearly the level of expert at the game system or numbers in general for you to be just taking this at face value and just immediately implementing this into your game. Definitely, look at what I'm saying, decide if it's right for you. I just wanted to just talk a little bit about why I use it in my game and why I think it's okay for you to use it in your game if it interests you or your players. So, first of all, let's talk about the history of why dexterity has the reputation that it has. We've talked about before in the other editions, it was very strong. It covered everything from saving throws to numerous skill checks to your AC, all sorts of ability. And it still covers a lot of that in 2nd edition. But 2nd edition has gone a long way to making up that ground for the other statistics. So what I want to talk about is right now is all the ways that dexterity has been downplayed in 2nd edition, because all this conversation is based solely on the fact that the developers did such a good job, I think a better job than they realized when they readjusted how the ability scores influence the game. I think that the decision to not allow dexterity to damage by default with certain weapons is something that is a holdover to either the 1st edition, the game, maybe even a little bit of trauma from the types of builds that people would do in 1st edition, and the attitude that a lot of people have in 5th edition of dexterity to damage. And it's a strong stat, and it does a lot. But I think that with all the other changes they've implemented, that I no longer believe it's necessary to limit dexterity in that way. I think dexterity has lost quite a bit, and hopefully I can illustrate that to you a little bit here. So it is no longer the default for initiative. Yes, you can still use things like stealth to roll your initiative, but most characters in most situations are still going to be using perception. And I mean, heck, you can use any skill now for initiative in the right circumstances. And a character that's insistent upon using their intelligence modifier or their strength modifier or whatever for initiative is going to find ways to do it pretty often. So the fact that the default is now wisdom based instead of dexterity based is already a big impact. And bigger than you may think, because not only is it saying dexterity is not this important, but it's also saying that a character who focuses on strength with no dexterity in heavy armor still has the potential to act first and be able to get to that front line, be able to get where they as a tank are most needed. And it's something that I've talked before that I really love. It's one of the biggest changes in 2nd edition, or one of the smaller changes in 2nd edition that I think has the biggest impact in terms of your frontline characters now actually have a chance to get to the front line and be able to use that armor that they have to protect their allies. It's only affecting 3 of the 17 skills now versus I think it used to affect 7 in 1st edition. And to be fair, a lot of skills got folded in. I think we have about half as many as we used to. But I think it's still worth noting that outside of a thievery type character, dexterity is not going to be doing a whole lot for you as a player in terms of skills. Whereas before it was pretty important for surviving a lot of situations. Again, still mostly sort of thievy type scenarios, but just the idea that it would apply to so many different ways was really, really strong. And sure, most of those skills that were lost were just combined into other dexterity-based skills, but it is still worth noting that it's only taking up about 1/6 of the skill list versus where it used to take up almost a 4th or 5th. So that's important. And then finally, and this is a big one, is it's no longer used for ranged attacks with magic. So in 1st edition Pathfinder, if you wanted to roll your attack for a ray or any sort of ranged touch effect, you would be rolling dexterity. And now you're adding your relevant ability score modifier, whatever you use to factor in all your other things with your spells, your DCs and things like that. Intelligence for wizards, wisdom for druids and clerics, and charisma for bards and sorcerers. So those are some pretty big debuffs to what dexterity can do. Those alone would not be enough to justify, I think, adding dexterity to damage. Because while it's lost those things, it's still really good in plenty of other areas. It's still got a saving throw that it's the only game in town for. It's still affecting your AC, and it's still affecting 3 really good skills and range, and most ranged weapon attacks. But in addition to those nerfs to what dexterity covers, there's also been some boosts to strength. While strength doesn't really cover any more than it used to, some of the things like bulk have been made so much simpler and so much easier to use that bulk is now being tracked a lot more than encumbrance used to be. I know both my games I'm paying attention to it, where I never used the old encumbrance rules, but it's much simpler, it's much more intuitive, it's something that you can estimate really easily and that everyone can sort of get their minds around without feeling like you are sort of nickel and diming your players and getting too into the weeds with little adjustments. In addition to that, having a high enough strength can reduce or even negate armor penalties, whether that's checks or movement speeds. This is a huge boost to characters that want to go the armor route instead of the dexterity route. It used to be that not only was dexterity on your dexterity a bigger boost to your AC than maybe was proportional to some other options like armor and things like that. But on top of that, being a character in light armor or no armor, you were faster than the character in full plate. So you had higher AC than the guy who had this really expensive armor, and he was slow and brutal. It's no longer the case now. Sure, if you go all the way to full plate, you might still be slow. That's something that I would, and I have house ruled to say that if you've got even higher strength than the normal threshold, that you can completely negate those options. But even without that home rule or that house rule, I think that the fact that you no longer have to suffer those penalties necessarily for types of armor, and when you do suffer those penalties, you're in heavy armor, which is actually giving you some damage reduction and some other nice little boosts. I think that's a pretty big deal and a pretty big boost to characters that want to focus on strength and con and leave dexterity behind in favor of wearing heavy armor. The other thing is the cost that I sort of mentioned. Now, because of the way that the prices work, and really they sort of did before, but now it's actually in the book that a suit of +1 full plate costs the same as a suit of +1 leather armor, because the actual armor themselves are so little of the cost compared to the runes that you're putting on it that it's negligible. It doesn't matter. You're paying for the rune, what you attach it to, who cares? So that's really cool. And that's another big boost, because again, you used to be slower with worse AC and you had to pay more to get there, all because you had a character that wasn't focused solely on dexterity. With that said, in addition to that, offensively, strength got a big boost in the athletics department. While reflex saves can defend against some of those effects, as far as I know, there's not really many exceptions to the fact that if you're trying to trip somebody or grapple somebody or push somebody, you're going to be using strength-based athletics check. And so offensively, that is a huge boost to strength, whereas before there were a lot of ways, and there may be down the line, but there aren't yet in second edition. But first edition had a lot of ways where you might be able to get dexterity to that attack roll instead. But for right now, athletics is strength-based, and that is nothing to scoff at in a game where getting any sort of edge on an opponent can take a threat down, can make it so that your entire party can exploit that weakness and hammer home some really big shots. So that's a big boost to strength. And moreover, we talked, going back to the AC, is they've really tightened the balance on that. Whereas before, having high dex and some magical light or medium armor would put you through the roof on AC versus most people in full plate. Now it's a lot closer, and depending on which level you're at, being what your current dexterity score is versus your current armor bonuses that you're getting, your runes and potency boosts on those armors, very often somebody in full plate is going to be as good or better than somebody in no armor or light armor, especially light armor. No armor, with your monks and your rogues who just see no reason to wear armor, is pretty good. If you're going to take your dexterity all the way to the 22 max and maybe get the apex item even, but with that said, anybody who's not going to devote fully into dexterity like that is going to find that good armor with the right runes and 1 to 2 points of dexterity are probably going to be as good as 7 points. And while you still might be able to edge out in dexterity, I think sometimes, depending on what your class is, you could edge out armor with dexterity, especially if you're wearing the adventurer's clothes that can have the runes. You might still be beating, but you've invested so many of your stat points, so many of your maximum stat points, which it's hard to get more than 1 over 20, that you've paid a cost, and you deserve that edge. But it's a pretty slight edge, and it's situationally doesn't even exist. So, when somebody can functionally keep up to you by spending the same amount of gold, I have to question whether that extra point of AC is necessarily worth it when you could have put several more points to other ability scores and gotten almost as far. And then let's go to the other side of the gear. Let's go to weapons. So most weapons that I or anyone would propose get dexterity are pretty well laid out in the thief racket on rogue, and it's things with the finesse trait. It's gonna be just lighter, smaller weapons, which means they're dealing significantly less damage than some of the strength-based weapons. Now, at low levels, the difference between a 1d6 rapier may not seem that big compared to a 1d8 longsword, but as you add striking runes, as those dice get multiplied, you're going to find those numbers quickly do add up. So even if you did allow a character to have dex to damage, and they're using a rapier versus dex to damage, or versus strength to damage, and they're using a longsword, the rapier fighter will not be keeping up compared to the longsword. They're both using one-handed weapons. They both have some interesting, useful traits maybe, but at the end of the day, the longsword is just going to be beating it on damage, no two ways about it. And that doesn't even account for the fact that there's, to my knowledge, no two-handed finesse weapons, nothing where you can get above a d6 at all, whereas if you wanted to have a bastard sword, for example, on your fighter versus a short sword or a scimitar on this character, you have the option to go to a much larger damage die if your shield breaks, or if you just decide to cast it aside and just, go for the Hail Marys. So that's a versatility option that the finesse characters don't have. They don't have the option for the two-handed weapons, and that puts them out on reach. They don't have options for reach. It also really limits or completely negates their access to many weapon traits, which can really just be a huge number of fighting style options or niche benefits, and sometimes not very niche benefits. So that, combined with the fact that they're in theory neglecting strength, means that a dexterity-based character is not only hitting less hard, not only having lower chances of success with things like athletic to trip and grapple, but they're also having fewer opportunities to even try because they don't have those weapons that have those ability traits built in. So in addition to that, I want to state that I'm not suggesting we add dexterity to damage on ranged weapons. I think that just having to not be in melee is boost enough for the ranged weapons. I think they're fine where they are. But what does sometimes get applied is strength with some propulsive weapons, whether it's slings or long bows and short bows. So that means that even a character who focuses very much on dexterity, who is going to possibly be the best, the most accurate with a bow, still might not deal as much damage as somebody who has a pretty good strength score. So what that means is that that, combined with the fact that ability scores are a lot more generous and designed in a way to be a lot more spread out in the increases, whereas before you might only increase 1 or 2 stats your entire career because you had to focus on what your most important ones were. Now you can increase those most important ones, and you've still got 2 boosts left to put wherever you want, and eventually you hit diminishing returns if you keep stacking up the same one. Still probably a good idea on at least one of your main stats, but not necessarily on your second. So what that means is that you're going to have characters that are more likely to have a few points in strength or dexterity regardless of what their focus is, which means that there's not really any viable dump stat anymore. Intelligence probably could use some help. But yeah, so you have a system where dexterity is no longer applying to numerous things that it used to apply to. It will never catch up in flat damage because it's just got worse access to melee weapons. There is no way, at least right now, that I know of, maybe some strange runes that I've not seen, but there's no way that I know of to add dexterity to ranged damage at all, whereas there is for strength. And I don't think that dexterity's got the huge edge that it used to. Does that mean that you should use dexterity to damage? I don't know, maybe. I'm doing it, But at the end of the day, I don't know what your table looks like. I don't know what your players look like. In my game right now, I've always, even in first edition, as ill-advised as that was in a lot of ways, I would allow dexterity to damage. In second edition, I have 5 players in my online game, and I had, of them, one was primarily a ranged character. He did not have any strength. The other is a swashbuckler. He still has some strength. And a magus who turned into a sorcerer, and she is still dex-based in her attack because most of her damage comes from her spells. So she had no reason to worry about adding strength damage, but again, we do dex damage. But of those 5, my 2 heaviest hitters are still my strength-based characters, my barbarian and my monk, who is not a monk. But so, even in a system where I gave them the option to use dexterity to damage, strength is still being chosen in equal measure. So in my experience, it hasn't encouraged anyone to try to ham it up with dexterity, because the reality is that second edition is built so much better than 3.0, Pathfinder first edition, and in my opinion, 5th edition in terms of balance. It's a really solid system, and I think that when they made the decision to not allow dex to damage to every class, only the thief, I honestly think they were basing that decision either on non-finalized rules where they hadn't completed all those changes, or from a mindset where they were still remembering how overpowered it was and thinking that they could just that they would just rather avoid the possibility of it being overpowered by limiting it in that one big way. But I think they built a nearly perfectly balanced system especially in terms of at least the ability scores, where it's not necessary to make that distinction and make that nerf to dexterity. With all that said, why should you do it? I've just made a case for why characters are not more effective having dexterity added in. I've made cases for how well balanced the ability scores are. So why should you make this change that's potentially going to have problems? Well, for one thing, it can be a nice way to increase the number of types of builds available to players. A character who wants to build a dex-based fighter and has no need to focus on strength can still put up high damage. Not as high as if he was using a 1d8 strength-based weapon, certainly, but high damage nonetheless. Something that by choosing a 1d6, a rapier, or a scimitar, whether it's for a really specific character option, focusing on certain traits, or just a flavor option. They just like the idea of having the rapier or the scimitar, or having the 2 knives even. Just these character concepts that are a lot less viable without adding dexterity to damage become more viable without breaking the game. And it allows characters or players to make their characters feel even more different, feel even more varied, and it allows them to make decisions based on flavor without having to worry about how mechanically bad a choice may be. And I really do feel like it's one of the few blind spots of the system that, as customizable and universal and pick what you want, there's no bad decisions, if you're anything except a thief rogue, using anything besides a strength-based weapon is usually a bad idea. And it's something that I think is counterintuitive in a lot of ways to what second edition is about. Now, with that said, I'm definitely biased. I really like the idea of having a dex-based character who can deal damage without having to also have strength. And I also, I'm part of this is me bringing in these real-world concepts as well. As somebody with very limited, not anything to brag about, but I've I'm pretty nerdy. I've played with swords before, and I like rapiers, and I've looked into a lot of like behind the scenes fight choreography and things like that. And weapons like a rapier, there's no place for strength with a rapier besides just control. But if you try to overpower someone with a rapier, you're going to break that weapon. You're not going to deal more damage because you're strong. You're going to break it. And that's just the thing. The thing with some of those weapons is about precision, not power. And it's always seemed strange to me, the idea that strength would factor in at all with using some of those weapons that, in the real world, not really. And listen, this isn't the real world, and we all know it, of course. But there's just, everybody's got their hang-ups, and that happens to be one of mine. So that's why, those are all the reasons why I do the dexterity damage, and why I don't think that it's going to hurt your game if you do it. It's going to be a nice way for you to encourage your players to build in ways that aren't necessarily supported. It's going to be a way to diversify the types of attacks and weapons that you see when it's not just rogues that are using those light D6 weapons, because the fighter feels like he can use it without taking such a huge hit to his damage output. But it's not going to break your game. One thing that it will do is it's going to make your thief racket need something else to boost it. So what could this be? I don't know. I'm reluctant to just give them a damage boost. Thankfully, I don't have any thief racket rogues. I did just get one, actually, and I think what I did with him was I just gave him an extra class feat to make up for the fact that his racket boost is negligible. That may not be enough. I'm not sure. Let me know down in the comments if you have any other ideas how to balance that thief class if you do allow that dexterity to damage, or that thief racket, I should say. So thanks for coming to my TED Talk. And again, this is not to convince you necessarily to add dexterity to damage in your game at all. Always run the game that you want to run, that you're comfortable with, that makes sense to you and your table. But I did want to, it's something that's going to not only has come up in the past and will continue to come up, is my dexterity to damage house rule. And I just wanted to explain that a little bit and why I think that's okay. And maybe it's something that you decide to implement in your game, or at least try out. And let me know if you do, if you find problems. I'm expecting a lot of expecting a lot of you to disagree with me down in the comments. You're normally very nice folks, but I'm sure there's going to be a few ruffled feathers. Maybe not, but either way, even if you don't agree, thanks for sticking out. Thanks for listening. If you are going to disagree with me, be nice about it down there. Don't be rude to me or to each other. And thanks so much for sticking around and listening. And welcome to the collective. We'll see you next time. Bye.